Hello and welcome to the Anime Rambling Boys podcast, ARB for short. I am the artist formerly known as Ricky, aka Tropical Robot. What happened to Ricky? Some say he died during the Holy Grail War. We don't really know.
All right, and I'm bass, not bass, not the fish, also not the musical note. It just sounds cool. What up, everybody? We're here.
Silver, which is higher in quality than gold.
Controversial statements, please. Hot takes later. Hot takes later.
Oof. And today we're going to be talking about an anime that's near and dear to Silver and I's hearts, and something to which Base is new to, aka Fate Zero. So, general impressions of the show, gentlemen. What did you think?
Masterpiece. 10 out of 10. Little as close to a 10 out of 10 as I've ever seen in anime. Yes, I've seen it multiple times, and that may be very high praise, but you can't argue with facts.
Oh my god, can't argue with facts. Okay, as someone who's like completely new to anything Fate whatever, overall impression of the show, it's a good show, great show. I feel like I say this every episode. Like, it's a good show, but I don't want to be that guy. I will say though, if you are like me coming into this for the first time, have a friend like I have these two who can just tell you like certain things going on, because you will have questions. You will be watching and being like, there's a lot of terms being thrown around that are all capitalized in the subtitles if you watch it subbed. And I'm like, what's that? Pause the episode, Wikipedia. So, it's a good show, but do know you're going to have to do a little bit of work if you're just coming into this for the first time.
Lots of questions about world building. And I'm
yes.
serious because I said the world and not the world.
Oh my god. We'll have a JoJo's episode eventually.
One day.
One day.
We're not ready for that yet.
Yeah, my general impressions of the show. This is the second time I've seen it. First time I've seen the dub. I mean the sub, not the dub. I was really caught by the voice acting in the sub. The dub is amazing, frankly. I actually think the script in the dub is better than the translation in the sub. I think Silver and I are in agreement about this.
Yep.
But yeah. But this time around, I really I remember when I first watched it, it was just kind of like I was much like you, Base, where it was like a lot of information coming at me at once. But I remember just being like, holy shit, like this is just so philosophically rich. And this time around, I really made an effort to unpack some of the ways in which it is philosophically rich, and I think move beyond some of the I guess like consensus opinions about Fate Zero within like the Anitube community, because I think that while, there's a lot of folks who've done some wonderful work on Fate Zero by, for example, calling it a Greek tragedy, and having these like very substantial analysis, I think that there are some, flaws to those analyses that I, kind of feel like I can, through my input, help to, add to the discourse and whatnot.
Yeah, so we have what we see. We have, the fan in Silver, the auteur in Tropical Robot, and the guy who just watched it and is still like, what is going on?
All right, so I think we should probably move to just kind of talking about the show itself, right? I guess maybe a little bit of discussion about the plot or whatever, but I'll let you guys kind of take it where you want with this, if anything comes to mind.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll start. The general premise of the show is there are 7 people. They're all mages. They do magecraft. The differentiation between magecraft and magic we'll get to later, but it is very important. What you need to know is that these 7 mages, who are called masters, summon heroic spirits from past or future to fight in this Holy Grail War to obtain the Holy Grail to gain some kind of miracle slash wish. It varies per person. And all the yeah, that's all I can really think of to like really describe like the plot itself. And then, Baze, do you have anything else to add on to that?
In the first 20 minutes of episode 1, you're gonna get this scene where the two where obviously, okay, I also want to say there's a lot of names in this show. There's a lot of names. So if we get it wrong, we're gonna apologize right now about pronunciation. But you get a scene where Kyrie, who's an important character, we'll get to him later, is just being circled by 2 other characters, and they're just dumping information, all this backstory onto you. And by the end of episode 2, though, you do get the general plot. It's like you said, there's 7 people who are like, hey, I want this mystical object in this war we're gonna fight, so I'm gonna summon a person from history, from mythology, to fight on my side. And there are different classes and, different strengths and abilities of all these characters, and they each have their own motivations for why they're doing the thing that they're doing. And it just delves into like interesting, because the way the show is, I guess, plotted is that each of the 7 pairs of characters, the master and the heroic spirit servant, has their own story to tell, and they all like hit and conflict with each other at different points.
And we'll definitely dive a little bit more into that point, which Base just brought up about the multiple perspectives in the story, because I actually think it's one of the things that most important things that differentiates Fate Zero from a standard Greek tragedy. And it's so obvious, it's so in your face from the beginning. But anyways, yeah, no, but anyways, I think this is a good segue to talking about some of the characters in Fate Zero, more specifically kind of like introducing them or whatnot. So what did you guys think of the characters, of the wide and varied cast?
Well, before we start off with that, I think we should introduce like the class system first, so that way people aren't confused when we're calling people like Saber and Archer and things like that. So the 7 masters summon 7 class containers, and they go from Saber, Archer, Lancer, Caster, Rider, Assassin, and Berserker. And each just depends on, like, obviously, like, Saber, gotta use swords, but that is actually kind of controversial because there's a lot of archers that can throw swords at people.
Yeah, basically each of the classes is a rough Dungeons and Dragons style approximation of their abilities. Like if I said this person's a Lancer, you have a vague idea of what they can do, but each of them also has their own mystical and magical abilities that makes them unique. So each of those 7 classes, let's just start maybe at the top and go through each one. So at first, and probably the main character, she seems like, as someone who's just coming to the series, the face of the franchise. You have Saber and her master, Emiya, I'm gonna mispronounce this, Kiritsugi?
Kiritsugu.
Oh, God.
Emiya.
Yeah, I'm gonna call him Emiya because, and I know there's another character down the line that shares that last name, but we're not talking about that series. We're talking about Fate Zero. So there's only one Emiya right now, so it's fine. So starting off with like Emiya and Saber. Saber, also spoiler alert, I guess, because if you're listening to this, we hope you've watched the show. And even if not, but we will be dropping spoilers about everything. So Saber is the personification of the old Arthurian legend King Arthur, but she is a woman who's named Arturia. And it's sort of like a shock to the characters too, but it's brought up as like, oh, I'm the legendary hero even though I'm a woman, but I played as a man in history in order just to, help lead my people. So you have Saber, King Arthur, with Emiya, who is anything but like her at all.
Absolutely. And in fact, he's kind of the kind of a cookie cutter consummate utilitarian. He's someone who as a result of a tragedy in his past, kind of adopted this philosophy of, well, first of all, he adopted this goal of wanting to end war at all costs, and then he decided that the way to do that, the proper way to do that, to live ethically, would be by maximizing the amount of benefit and minimizing the amount of harm. He's someone who ended up becoming an assassin, a mage assassin, as a result of the events that took place in his early life. And that's kind of where he's coming at it. So in the Grail War, he like fights very dirty, and he justifies his, let's say, I don't know, not the most honorable tactics through appeals to that ideology that he has.
So yeah, on one hand you have Saber, who's like, oh, straight up fighting for glory, but it's like we have to do this in an honorable knightly way. Like she's called the King of Knights, and she's like, I will win the Holy Grail in the most like straightforward battle type way that I know I can. While Emiya over here is just like, I will use any tactic. I don't care how, like, it makes me feel ethically. I don't care how it is, because I know at the end of the day, it'll be better. So as an assassin, he's cold, calculating, on the surface at least, and immediately has conflict with Saber, because he feels that, like, she's just not going to do what I say. And so there are definitely times throughout the story where he even tricks Saber into doing things, and that causes more conflict between them. So that's like those characters' additional conflicts. And then Emiya also has a supporting cast of characters. Like, each of the pairs also has supporting cast of characters. And that we can get into later, because his supporting cast is probably the most important.
The best way to summarize Kiritsugu is that he is the personification of the ends justify the means.
Yes, that's actually pretty perfect. Which, at first, I was like, oh, you're that guy. But at the end, it does like come back around to, I think, a satisfying conclusion, to where it made him like at least probably my favorite character to like track through the series, just to see how his inner thought processes were going.
Yes. And then when people cite the idea that Fate Zero is a Greek tragedy, they tend to identify Kiritsugo as the main tragic hero of the story.
Right.
Yeah, for reasons we'll get into later. But in addition to Kiritsugo and Saber, we have 6 other master-servant pairs. I think moving from Kiritsugo to his main rival probably makes sense. His main rival is Kire Kotamine, who is a member of the church, which is an institution within the broader Nazuverse, or the Type Moon universe that like Fate Zero takes place in. And he is, really someone whose journey throughout the story is all about, in like a really twisted way, self-discovery. He's also a psychopath, so his journey is about discovering that he's a psychopath. Yeah, no, it's kind of crazy. And he begins the story with having Assassin as his servant, but Assassin isn't, at least in my opinion, really too much of a character. She's just kind of a proxy there, because there's actually 100 of them, are actually just kind of a proxy for, the commands and actions of Kire. And by the end of it, he ends up kind of hijacking the servant of another one of the masters, Tokiyomi Tosaka, who is actually Kirei's mentor, and who taught him everything he knows about, well, maybe not everything he knows, but a lot about magecraft.
Yeah. So one thing we could just start off with Kyrie, because I think Kyrie is the first character you really interact with in the series. Like in the first episode where I talked about where his father and Tosaka are circling him and sort of explaining what's going on. And from the jump, so you have this Holy Grail War setup where it's like, oh, we have decided that the rules are going to be these 7 people are gonna summon these servants, they're gonna fight it out, and whoever's the winner gets the Holy Grail. And you think about that, like, yeah, there are these rules about who can participate, who's what, how the fights are supposed to go. But when you really think about something like, I have a chance to obtain the Holy Grail, why wouldn't I cheat? So it was actually refreshing to see how Kirie and Tosaka, who technically are supposed to be like, just fighting for their own personal glory, from the jump, collaborate to like, hey, we are going to make it so that Tosaka wins. And then they also bring in the church, who's supposed to be officiating it, who is being overseen by Kirie's father, in order to make events that Tosaka wins. Because if Tosaka wins, they believe it'll be the most beneficial for their side. Their ultimate motives of reaching the root are stuck in lore and aren't really maybe as important to this story. But you have Tosaka, Kirie, and Kirie's father, who represent like the church and an old magic family, and they're all collaborating together to make sure Tosaka wins. So Kirie at first is sort of just, a servant dog. He's highly effective. Probably the strongest, like, base character without a servant. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
I would say that's pretty tied.
Yeah, between him and
Kiritsugu.
Yeah, between him
Emiya.
and Emiya. I'm not gonna say his name. Between him and Emiya, they are probably the 2 most, like, by themselves capable characters. So to have him start off already being like, I'm going in this knowing I'm going to like serve someone else, really made it interesting, to where later in the series he does develop his own motives, and that's sort of how it goes for his entire story, which also jumps into Tosaka's story, who is the master of Archer, Gilgamesh, ancient mythological character, who in theory is like the strongest character in the show. Like, just the powers this man wields are absurd. But because he's so powerful, he is not a servant to Tosaka at all. Like, Gilgamesh immediately stands as like, I am a god, I am the king, I get to do whatever I want, and you serve me. And so their relationship, Tosaka's and Gilgamesh's, is completely flipped from the typical quote-unquote master-servant relationship. So you have Emiya on one side, who's sort of like trying to accomplish X goals. Kirie, who starts off as like someone who's been ordered to help someone else accomplish their goals. Tosaka, who's wielding incredible power, but has to like who has to play coy with it in order to accomplish his goals. And then you have probably, I know Silver's gonna go off on this, you have Waver and Ixander, aka Waver, who's a normal student mage who gets Rider as his class, and Ixander, aka the Persian / Middle Eastern name for Alexander the Great. Yeah, and they're probably the most, how should we say, fun characters to watch. I mean, Silver, you can talk about this. You take this over.
Oh yeah. Well, first off, the pronunciation is Iskander.
Oh,
but aside from that, yeah, there were, to me, like, one of the things I love about Fate Zero is that, aside from counting Kiritsugu and Saber, because it's kind of like slightly understood that they're the main characters, but not really. To me, Iskander and Waver were my favorite characters and my main characters to watch, because they were just so much fun. Waver starting off as like, oh, he just wants to prove himself. He steals an ancient relic from his master, who is also a master in the Holy Grail War. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then he summons the literal personification of, like, possibility, Iskandar. He conquered most of the world, and he's accomplished everything that Waver wants to essentially be. And that causes, like, a little bit of, like, contention and conflict between the two, because Iskandar kind of mocks him from the very beginning, saying, you only want to get the Holy Grail to get a little bit taller so people would acknowledge you. That's not why you should be doing things. And so watching that relationship develop as the story went on was my favorite to watch. And let's see. I mean, without talking about them, you have to talk about the servants of the Master of Lancer, Kenneth Lord Emeloy, who was an instructor at this institution for magecraft that Weaver was a part of. And he, like, to start off, he just, like, rips on Weaver for stupid papers, saying, like, oh, like, there's a whole, like, background ideology of classism and elitism in the show. We'll probably get to that later. But essentially, he rips on Weaver for saying, like, oh, no, your family does not, like, set your destiny in stone. Like, you can, like, be good at magecraft if you, like, do blah, 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 blah. Kane is like, nah. Weaver gets mad. He steals his relic, summons Alexander the Great. So that forces Kenneth to summon someone completely at random, and that just causes a whole different contention between Kenneth and his servant. Because the servant that he summons, the Ermood, is another knight who's very about honor, very about, like, very similar to Saber. And Kenneth is the polar opposite of that. He doesn't care for that whatsoever.
Yeah, Kenneth is more about, like, the glory of winning. He's not like Emiya in that he's a ruthless pragmatist. He's straightforward, as in, like, oh, this is going to be a fight of people who are, like, honorable, who are fighting for the glory of the Holy Grail, and Lancer is my servant, therefore he is going to help me obtain my goals no matter what.
Yep.
And that's probably Kane's biggest flaw, is that he is neither so pragmatic as Emiya as to do whatever it takes, but he's also not, like, how should we say, obsessively powerful enough that he's still arrogant about his abilities that it gets him messed up later in the story.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. So there's a couple things I want to pick up on very quickly. One, I want to make sure that we are, I guess, like, semantically accurate in, like, describing, Kiritsugo's pragmatism as being rooted in utilitarianism, because I actually think that, as contrasted with Tokiomi Tosaka, because I think Tokiomi Tosaka is actually the character who's most similar to, like, what we could call unmediated pragmatism, just, like, kind of prioritizing success over anything else, as he defines it. Because Kiritsugo does have that, like, guiding moral and ideological compass, which I think is important to keep track of that. The other thing that I wanted to say is, two comments. First, on Kenneth. So Kenneth, as you all have rightly pointed out, is, that kind of a self-righteous and aristocratic scholar, and, back to what Silver was talking about, he really is doomed, I would say, by the overemphasis that he places on bloodlines. But, and sort of, like, the status that's, like, associated with that. And, there's, like, the classism that Silver brought up. And then secondly, Lancer is, his quintessential character. But it's interesting. We'll get into this later when we're exploring, like, the ideologies of the different characters. But he does serve, this ideal of honor over everything, but he does it so blindly that it prevents him from seeing and making an accurate judgment about the character of Kenneth, whom is, frankly, a profoundly dishonorable person, and then, to sort of move on a little bit, then we got the wild cards. Anybody want to start talking about the wild cards in the Holy Grail War?
We'll talk about Bugman, who, for the first, I'm like, well, I guess this series of Fate Zero is roughly divided into 2 seasons, right?
Yeah.
The first season is, like, the introduction to all the characters, and then it accumulates in a big battle to stop one of the characters, which we'll get into later. And then the second season is more about the actual getting back to the Holy Grail War. But my favorite character, at least for the very interesting first season, because his motivations were clear from the beginning, and it was sort of already going down that path of sad. We have Bugman, aka, I know his last name is Matoi. Karia Matoi. There's a lot of K names, guys. There's a lot.
I wonder if that was intentional.
Huh. Interesting. Maybe it's a quirk, probably a quirk of the language that, like, as an English speaker, I just don't have privy to. Like, I can't see the katakana of how they're spelled. They probably all mean something.
Yeah.
Can't speculate on that. But Karya Matoi, who is sort of Mato, who comes into the Holy Grail War sort of as an not necessarily unwilling, he's fully willing participant, but he joins not in order to win the Grail for himself, in order to prevent someone else from going down this dark path that he doesn't want to. So basically, Karya left his magical family a long time ago because he was disgusted with their means and was just like, I don't want any part of this. But when his friend's daughter his friend basically gives up her daughter to Tosaka's, because his friend is in, oh, this is confusing, I'm sorry. His friend is married to Tosaka. Right?
Right.
As you can see, all the characters are in weird ways connected. But his friend is married to Tosaka. So Tosaka has 2 daughters. And one of them, Rin, he's like, you will inherit everything I have. The other daughter, he gives to Karya's family in order for them to have something magical because their family has been diluted in magical talent for a couple years. But the process of becoming a powerful person in Karya's family is very brutal. You basically have to become a host to like these man-eating bugs, and this young girl is gonna go through this, and Karya's just like, no way, I'm not gonna do this. He goes to his head of his family, who has his own story and all that stuff, and basically says, if I win you the Holy Grail, will you let this girl go? And of course, they're just like, well, we have nothing to lose, so yes, go do that. So Karya goes through the process of injecting himself with these bugs to give him magical talent way beyond his abilities, but it's brutal and it's ending his life as he speaks, but he really feels like he's on this journey to save this one person, and if he can do that, everything will be okay.
And we'll definitely, it seems like we might have some differences of interpretation with Karya, but I think that's like a really good way of describing, kind of like what he ends up, like his motivations as he understands them.
Right. Oh, and then his Berserker, which, just think of any type of Berserker from any RPG you can think of. It's stated to be one of the most powerful of the classes, but as you can probably imagine, very uncontrollable, very wild. But Berserker even eventually has his own story to tell.
Yes, Berserker is in fact Lancelot. And I don't know if our audience is necessarily familiar with Arthurian legend, but I think the Fate Zero does a good job of unpacking, that they're Lancelot, for folks who are unfamiliar, basically I guess, had an affair with King Arthur's wife, if I'm getting that correctly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Guinevere is King Arthur's wife.
Yes. And then, that's something that came to light. I think he ran away with her. That's something that came to light. It was a great portrayal in amongst like the round table of knights. And so his story is kind of, him being someone who, and this relates to Saber's ideology, right, of like honor and justice and being like a martyr king, but also what ends up being her flaw as like as a character. But basically he felt like he wanted to be punished for his transgression, and he wanted to be understood as like a human being. But these were things that Saber did not do. These were things that Saber could not do as someone who was really mostly concerned with having a holier than thou kind of like cleaving to this ideal of like knightlyhood and like, being like a martyr king.
Right. And it just turns into a whole tragic tale of like Lancelot just having this inner hatred and anger towards himself, but also towards Saber, but like and it turns him into the berserker, and that's all revealed later in the end of the story. But for now, at the beginning, you're sort of just like, okay, he summoned this like wild, uncontrollable beast that could win him the whole thing, because in one of the first episodes, berserker goes like toe to toe with Gilgamesh, which at the time no one was able to do.
Yep.
And now we have our final master-servant pair. And if it sounds like we're just talking about like details, trust us, you need to have all this info down when you watch the show, because otherwise you're just going to be watching people running around, basically. There's a lot of talking in the show, and it is important to at least, maybe when you watch a show, you don't need like a notebook or something, but at least have like a track of like who is related to who is related to what, and why are they doing X? Because that'll save you a lot of time, honestly.
Yep. And so to kind of bring this character analysis to, I guess, provisional close, there's the last master servant duo, and these are the Psychopaths, aka Ryunosuke, I actually don't know his last name, I don't remember it, and Caster, aka Bluebeard, aka Gilles de Raw.
Yes, and if you don't know all these historical figures, Gilles de Raw was a French, I forget, noble person or like warrior who like was close or obsessed with Joan of Arc. The most important thing to know about him and Bluebeard is that in old French or West European folklore, Bluebeard is a known like child, like pedophile and killer.
Mm-hmm.
So he's summoned as the class Caster, which is all about summoning these, ethereal beings of like destruction, a lot of Lovecraftian monsters, a lot of tentacles.
Next hentai.
Oh my god, just a lot of tentacles.
A lot of tentacles.
And so he's probably the most like magic range-based, like obsessive character. And as Tropical Robot iterated, him and Ryunosuke is also Ryunosuke. I'm so bad at this.
Learn to pronounce things. I'm just kidding.
I'm trying. Ryunosuke is a murderer himself. He's a serial murderer, particularly of children, and he was actually in the process of like, oh, I'm gonna try to summon a demon because why not? And then he became Caster's master, and he was immediately thrilled. And from the get-go, they are the most in sync master-servant pair,
which is pretty terrifying, and they end up being the kind of like big bad guys of the first arc of Fate Zero.
Yeah.
In the first episode where Caster appears and like the little boy that Ryunosuke is about to kill and Caster lets him go, I thought, like, even just for a split second, I thought like it was gonna be one of those where Caster is just actually this super nice like guy, but like he just has to deal with Ryunosuke. But no, that's not what happened at all.
Oh, and also an important piece of background for Gilles de Rais that actually comes into play for the story itself. The backstory on him is that he was a general under Jeanne d'Arc who went insane or just started succumbing to madness once Jeanne d'Arc was like burned at the stake to the point that he started like cursing God, and then it just dived down from that to like what he ended up becoming. And that becomes a point of contention in the story because at one point he confuses the saber, which is Arthur Pendragon, to be Jeanne d'Arc, and that kind of basically embodies the biggest like conflict within the first arc, like the first season. Just like Caster trying to get Saber for himself, thinking that like, oh, I won the Holy Grail, my wishes come true, and conflict ensues from that.
So we have our 14 main players on the stage.
Yes, absolutely. Which I think is like, now that we've gotten that out of the way, it's a good point to transition into some of like the larger themes in terms of how to understand the story itself, and sort of like the events that take place. So commonly, within like the like anime YouTube community, a lot of folks tend to and you can specifically look at people like Alexander, who I love personally, and the cartoon cipher, as folks have been kind of instrumental in like advancing this idea. But there's people there's kind of a consensus that's formed that Fate Zero is a Greek tragedy. And I think that, they get a lot of stuff right in their analyses for sure, but I think ultimately that it's not an accurate claim to call Fate Zero a Greek tragedy. I think it's actually kind of reductive. And it does have a lot of elements of a Greek tragedy, but I think that these folks all kind of like base their arguments off of the same thing, which is like Aristotle and like his like the way that he kind of like defines tragedy and like the poetics. But I think that they miss some of the really like important things that distinguish this story, and that kind of make it relevant for us who are living in like modern society. Yes, we live in a society.
We're living in a society.
But namely, what I'm aiming to kind of talk about is like first of all, like we've already brought this up already in our discussion, but like the importance of like multi-perspectivity in this like in this story, which is not the same thing as there being multiple characters. It's basically like the idea of you having kind of a story where there are more than one character, each of which has like their own ideologies or their own ideals, and each of which is given ample amount of screen time, and where there's like a significant like interaction between like the different ideals and ideologies, and kind of seeing how that plays itself out within like the context of the story. So that's like one thing that I wanted to point out as far as like why it's like not a Greek tragedy, like what makes it, or I guess as far as like to kind of change that a little bit, what kind of makes it elements that are Greek tragic, where one, we could get really nitty-gritty with this shit, which I don't necessarily want to do here, but I think the most important things to point out are like it does follow like the structure of a Greek tragedy to a large extent. It does have like a common action, which is like kind of like what these like the overarching thing that these folks are trying to get done, but also how they end up like faring throughout the course of like the story. And that's like they all want to get a wish granted from the Holy Grail. And that's kind of like the thing that's like motivating their actions. And then there's also like the presence of like errors, like tragic or like like kind of like intellectual errors or errors made in ignorance or misjudgment that kind of lead these folks to like their downfall or to a lack of success. So those are kind of like the two big things that I think folks hit on that are in fact like there's more, but I want to keep this as brief as possible. But what I think when you bring in like the elements of like multi-perspectivity, it kind of lets you frame things as like it's not just focusing on like one character, like if the story were all completely about Kiritsugo, and like from his perspective, but it's kind of focusing on like all of the characters and how I think ultimately there's like a tragic flaw in most, if not all, of the ideologies of the characters. And what you kind of get that emerges from the narrative as a result of that is a story where basically you get this message that like simplistic ideologies are not able to like explain and lead to like one being able to like change like reality. There's like a problem, there's like a gap between our ideals and our ideologies and like what reality actually is.
Right. And like start off, it's like you could easily say there is no main character. Like sure, Emiya and Saber might get get a plurality of the focus, but they don't get a majority of the focus like at all. And then the flaws of each of the characters, like we stated some of them before, but you could really just delve into how like at the end of the day, like, they're all trying to get this wish, right? I'm just gonna say it. No one gets what they want at the end. Absolutely no one got accomplished their goals. In fact, so I mean, I know we just said
Well. There's some ambiguity as to this, for sure. But Kirei, whether or not the Grail granted his wish, which is what there's ambiguity about, he got what he wanted.
I think Kirei's story might be one of the most interesting stories. So, like we said before, he starts off as Assassin's Master. And within the first, like, couple of episodes, you get this sense, like, you know, Kirei's working for Tosaka and the church. He attacks Tosaka with Assassin, just straight off the bat. And from my perspective, I was like, oh, wait, Kirei is doing whatever it takes to win this thing. Maybe he'll have his own goals. And Assassin just gets wiped out immediately by Tosaka's Gilgamesh, Tosaka's archer. And Kirei immediately withdraws from the war and goes into protection under the church of his father. And you're just thinking to yourself, wow, he just failed and now he's bad. But you actually figure out later that no, this was all part of the plan, actually. Because, as we said before, since Assassin isn't just one character, it's multiple personalities, he's technically not out of it yet. He's just now retired so that the other characters can, like, forget about him and he can work behind the scenes. Which automatically shows from the get-go that this entire Holy Grail War, from, like, the people who made it, from the people who are administrating it, from the people who are participating in it, are all dirty. It's all a smokescreen and mirrors.
And it's all corrupt, you know?
Right.
Which ends up coming back around to kind of bite everyone that's, like, involved in the Holy Grail War, and even people who weren't involved in the Holy Grail War. But we'll get to that in a little bit.
And so Kirei basically goes along, just does background gathering information. The most important thing also to note is that him and Emiya note that the other person is the one other person in the entire group that they can't understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. So they're automatically set on a path to meet each other. So Kirei again uses the assassins just to spy, to help Tosaka win, to help, like, get accomplished closer to his goals. And then at one point, I think, is it like the first confrontation he has with Mayu, and it's at the Winter Castle. Is it where he re-enters the playing field? Is that correct?
I think the first time that it actually happens is when Kiritsugu Emiya blows up a hotel to try to get Lancer's Master to die.
Oh,
And then Kirei reads that move and he's there waiting for him, but he runs into Maya instead.
basically Kirei re-enters the field to kill Emiya. Instead, he runs into Emiya's wife and his assistant girlfriend
/ lover.
It's Emiya's got moves. Let's just say that.
So
It's left ambiguous as to what her actual thing is.
right. So a little bit of backstory on Emiya again. Each of these characters has a supporting cast too. There's a lot of characters involved. So in Emiya's case, the reason he's in the war is he was hired by this. There's one of the families, the Eisenburns,
Einsburns.
and they're like, hey, we created this homunculus, this fake human that will procreate with you in order to make our perfect soldier for a future Grail War. And they hire Emiya to meet with this homunculus, this woman. And it doesn't say this necessarily in the story, but in the background information, Emiya basically raised her, sort of. Not raised, that's not the correct word. It's like gave her a personality.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was born, she didn't really have much. She was intelligent, she's a fully grown woman, homunculus, like, can do things, but she has no perspective on the world. And Emiya kind of basically, this is all background information too that I read that wasn't like presented in the show too much. In the show, she's already like his wife and they're just together and they have a daughter. And so his wife, whose name is Iris Veal, who's is completely committed to accomplishing Emiya's goal. So from the get-go, they are in sync and are like, we are going to help each other to accomplish this goal, to make a better world also for our daughter and all that stuff. So, and then Emiya also has Mayu, who...
Wait, let me interject for a second, very quickly. And there's also a super interesting little bit of like homoeroticism between Irie and Saber, which is sort of, narratively speaking, played off as a sort of show like the contrast between like Iris Veal and Saber's like relationship, which is one of like genuine like, you know, love and care, and then Saber and Kiritsugo's relationship, which is really has them, you know, kind of diametrically opposed to each other, both in their methods, mainly in their methods.
Right. And from the beginning, Saber's always talking to Iris Veal, being like, why do you follow Kiritsugi? Or Emiya. Why do you follow... Yeah, this is so bad. I'm just going to keep calling him Emiya. I hope people know who I'm talking about. Like, why do you follow him? He's clearly, like, not, like, from my perspective, not that great of a guy. He's kind of dirty, underhanded, and blah, blah. And Iris Veal is always just like, he has a goal. She acts as the mediator between them and is like, as long as you trust in me and that I trust in him, you know what I mean? And so Saber goes along with that. And that sort of is their whole triangular relationship involved. And then you have Mayu, who is Emiya's assistant, that he... so Emiya was raised by an assassin and his previous... like childhood backstory. That's how he became how good he is. He found Mayu and gave her name. That's not even her real name. We don't know her real name. And raised her to be an assassin too. And then they are like also perfectly in sync on the whole like pragmatic assassin. We're just gonna do what needs to be done. She's completely loyal to him in every type of way. And then they also have a relationship which isn't explained much in the show either. Like, Emiya has a wife, an Iris Veal, but then he's making out with Mayu too. And then Mayu and Iris Veal also know about each other.
It's a polyamorous situation. Let's put it like that. It's a polyamorous situation.
Like, I think Ilias Field just recognizes that, like, yeah, like, she knows she's gonna die, and she doesn't really want Kiritsugo to be alone, so her ultimate thing is, like, he wants him to be happy, so she's not that upset about the whole like Mayu thing.
Right. And it doesn't cause any too much conflict between them. Like, I feel like they all have pre-established their relationships with each other. And like I said, there's no like secrets between Emiya and Iris Veal, at least when it comes to like the relationships they have with the other characters.
Yes. Now back to Kirei.
Yes. Back to Kirei.
So what I think is particularly interesting about Kirei, in the context of, okay, so I'm gonna throw a word out there, guys. Get ready, buckle your seatbelts, it's coming. I actually think that, you know, when I brought up the whole like multi-perspective thing as like a feature of the drama of Fate Zero, I actually think that, you know, that's something, you know, and we could like get into like the fucking like history of this, but like I'm not going to. Maybe in like some future content, we'll see. But basically the point that I wanted to make is that whole idea of like, you know, presenting like multiple perspectives is an idea that's like, you know, postmodern in nature. And that's like, oh, what the fuck is that kind of mean word? But like basically the point is that like, you know, to contrast like, you know, postmodernism with like modernism is like helpful to clear this up. Postmodernism kind of, so whereas modernism kind of holds that, you know, there's kind of like an objective truth with a capital T, and we can like know what that truth is. That's like the core of like the modernist belief through like rationality and science. Postmodernism kind of says, nah fam, actually truth is socially constructed, and there are limits to truth of the lowercase t, and there are limits to what like humans can know about shit. And there's kind of like an emphasis on like multiple perspectives that comes along, you know, and like stories and philosophies of like perspective that come about as a result of like, you know, the dawn of like postmodern thought. But to sort of like connect that back to like Kirei, and you know, kind of like the, I guess like the climate or the background noise of, you know, the story of Fate Zero. One thing that I think is quite interesting about Kirei, and this is something that was pointed out by, you know, it has like parallels to our world, where it was pointed out by like, lots of folks pointed this out, basically that like what started to happen when folks became aware about the relativity of like, you know, things like truth, is that people kind of were left with this like vacuum where they couldn't really like turn to like religion as like something that would fill their lives with meaning, because that had been dispelled as dogmatic, and they couldn't turn to like science as something that, you know, would fill them with certainty either, because there are limits to, you know, scientific inquiry. You know, science is, you know, not something that's going to give us like the answers to the riddle of the universe, you know, or so, you know, these arguments go. And so Kirei is an interesting figure because he's kind of caught between, you know, he's kind of that person who emerges in this like vacuum of meaning. He's you know, ends up being like a nihilist, right? But he just kind of like doesn't know who he is. And so he's kind of spent his life turning to religion and, you know, not really getting the answers that he wants from like religion and the church, and, you know, not really feeling satisfied with like the answers that he's gotten from magecraft, which is, and this is, I'm going to introduce a super important distinction, which is like almost always erased by folks who discuss this shit. Magecraft and magic are not the same fucking thing. They're different things. Magecraft is like alchemy and Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. It follows certain rules, and it can't, you know, like it can't like enact miracles. Like there's like it's rationally explainable. It's systematic. It's like science in that sense. Magic is miraculous. Magic is something that like defies like the established laws of the universe. And this is like all within like the, you know, the universe that like Fate Zero takes place in. But the point being that Kirei is kind of this person who, you know, doesn't really have meaning and in his life from either of those sources, and then he ends up like, so his story in the narrative ends up being one of like self-discovery, albeit like a fucked up story of self-discovery, where we end up with this like psychopath. And this is actually something that makes the story not super postmodern, in that postmodernism would say there's no inherent anything, but he is an inherent psychopath. So, you know, I don't want to make the claim that it's necessarily like a postmodern tragedy. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say there's elements of that in here. And so he does go through this journey of like self-discovery, and ends up kind of arriving at like a point where his conclusion is, I just want to fucking impose my will upon like reality, and like, you know, ideals don't fucking, you know, there's no absolute source of meaning, so I'm just gonna impose my will on reality. And that's what he does. He destroys, and that's who he becomes in the narrative.
He, along the way, is, let's just say, gently pushed along by his master's servant, Gilgamesh. Because Gilgamesh is my favorite servant. Of all the servants, Gilgamesh is the one I was most interested in seeing talk, because apart from, like, he's actual fighting and capabilities and talks about battle is actually secondary to, like, what he does behind the scenes with Tosaka and Kirei. Gilgamesh views Tosaka as completely just like someone who's just there. Just another person to bask in his glory. He doesn't really care about the war. He cares about the Holy Grail in the sense of, like, I only want it so that other people can't have it. Which to me is like an interesting take on the whole, like, supreme, arrogant, like, godlike being idea, where it's not even about, like, oh, it's not even that I want this. I just want it so you don't have it. Which, you know, is somewhat kind of a childish thing to think about. But when you're literally at least in his backstory, a half god, half human king that is the originator of pretty much every other quote unquote contemporary Western myth that we have in today's world. You would see how he would grow that ego. And the interesting about Gilgamesh is you see him casually. Other than Saber, you very rarely see the other servants just like walking around and interacting with people. Well, and Iskandar as well. So those three are like the three main like ones that like just go about the world still just not fighting, not even trying to think of ways to fight, but are just like, hey, let's explore a bit. And every time Gilgamesh is in his casual clothing, he lets his hair down, he just goes and pokes Kyrie a bit and he's like, hey, what do you like to do? Hey, you're enjoying yourself, aren't you? I'm noticing things about you. And as much as Kyrie denies it, he knows Gilgamesh is right. And so, at the end of the day, it actually becomes Gilgamesh who prods Kyrie to indulge deeper and deeper into his inner desires, which, in the end, and if we want to talk about tragedy, leads to like Tosaka's demise, actually.
Which is actually an interesting segue to kind of talk about Tosaka for a minute. Because, and keep this trend going of like these people's ideals and all that kind of having like flaws in them. Tosaka, as I've kind of mentioned before, the way that I understand him is he's a ruthless pragmatist, but he's also someone who's like very informed, much like Kenneth is by his like heritage, But to sort of get to his like his flaw, Tosaka, it's not that he doesn't, also to sort of qualify things a little, it's not that he doesn't like love his daughters, for example, like Rin and Sakura, who's the daughter that he ends up giving up to the Matos, because he does love them, but he just loves them in a way that's like twisted by his ideology, where he's like, it's all about like success and it's all about getting to the root, but he ends up being kind of blinded by his like aristocratic like cast of mind. He kind of like discounts Kyrie as like anything but being, like, he says he limits Kyrie to being like a pawn or a loyal vassal. And he's, we kind of mentioned this, kind of got into this a little bit. He's kind of honestly a little disingenuous towards Gilgamesh, because he's like, he kowtows to Gilgamesh, he like genuflects to him, but he also doesn't really understand, respect, or even attempt to like mutually align with like Gilgamesh and like the interest of like actually, like, I guess like coming together to win the war. And what kind of ends up happening is that, he's stabbed in the back by both of them. Like, he's actually stabbed, he's literally stabbed in the back by Kyrie. Kyrie pulls a sneaky on him and stabs him in the back.
He does, doesn't he? And it's when, and you see it coming, like, maybe not, like, the second Tosaka's like, I've taught you everything I have taught you, you've been so good for me, I made my will so that you could be the guardian if something were to happen to me over my daughter, and here's a big ass dagger that symbolizes my complete faith in you. Well, look at the time. Guess I should turn my back to you and walk away.
Death flags are everywhere.
It was one of those where I was just like, oh, I know what. And he just stabs in the back. Tosaka dies tragically. And even though for most of the story you could say he was an antagonist to many of the characters, it still was kind of like, he was just trying to do what he felt was right within his family. Like, it's even in, again, supplemental material is required for this, stated that he is one of the weakest heads of his family in, like, a long time. Right. And so he's constantly just trying to do his duty as the head of the Tosaka family to get to the root so they can accomplish their goals. And then, yes, he tragically gets killed. And then Gilgamesh is just like, well, now I'm aligned with Kyrie, and now I'm Kyrie's servant. But their relationship is much more even, at least. They have a mutual respect of each other way more than Tosaka and Gilgamesh had.
Yes, and to clarify things very quickly, this is after Assassin has been killed by Iskandar, which is something that happens, in the story. So Kyrie doesn't have a servant, and then ends up like teaming up with Gilgamesh, and they enter into this conspiracy to kill Tosaka. But that I think can sort of be a nice pivot towards like talking about first someone who has like a similar ideology to that of Tosaka, but is just frankly much more self-righteous, and that's Lord Ilmelui, Kenneth Archibald. But yeah, no, so he's basically the way that I see it, he's this kind of self-righteous and aristocratic like scholar, who again is like motivated by this like desire to get to the root, and he ends up being like a foil for Waver but Lancer as well. And ultimately he's doomed by in his case it's I think right in your face like the flaws of this like kind of like classist ideology, which is that he just completely underestimates Kiritsugo during their fight, and he's like, this guy could never defeat me, and then boom, just oof, ends up getting wrecked.
Yes, because if people don't know, Emiya's nickname is the Mage Killer. Like, he specializes in killing mages. So I don't know what Kenneth was thinking when he was like, well, I'm just gonna kill the Mage Killer.
He took a calculated
Hubris
risk,
was his downfall.
but man, was he bad at math.
Oh man, so calculated risk, but man, am I bad at math. So basically, in the first fight, that Kenneth himself participates in, Kiritsugo basically uses this special bullet which completely wrecks his quote-unquote magic circuits, which, don't worry about it too much, it's just the thing that magic is like used to connect to the body, or magecraft actually, because remember, there's a difference between magic and magecraft. And
important
because
distinction.
of that, he is done. He can no longer like use his magecraft. He can't fight. He's on the brink of death. He still has Lancer, but he's basically out of commission.
Also, important to note that he is a profoundly dishonorable motherfucker.
Oh yes. Who would have thought? Who would have thought gun? So
It's like rock, paper, scissors, but it's magic versus gun.
right. So, but going back to the thing. So after Kenneth is basically subdued, his wife, right?
Yes. Well, fiance.
His fiance, who has also been supporting him. Basically, Kenneth had his fiance supply the mana for Lancer to be corporal in the world. So they're already a team. But because Kenneth is out, his wife, or fiance, who has been sort of just in the background for most of the story, just sort of supporting, so brutally takes control of Lancer from him.
Mm-hmm.
So basically,
attempts to wrest control of Lancer, but this kind of gets to like Lancer and like his like honor-bound ethic, where he's just like, I'll only serve you because you're working for my master, who is the person that I pledge my loyalty to as an honorable knight should. But sort of get into like why he believes that. It's quite interesting because in fact the reason why Lancer sort of like blindly serves this like ideal of honor is, and it ends up, ultimately being like his downfall, his tragic, flaw, his harmatia, as Aristotle might say. I don't know why I just pronounced it that way, but you know what? Let's run with it. But anyways, yeah. But anyways, he in his past life ran away with the woman that was promised to his kind of like military knightly leader, Fionn McCumhale, and then he confessed to what happened, brought everyone back. He was kind of hoping he'd get away with it and things would be fine. He could atone for what he did, and no, he was killed by Fionn. So the lesson that he learned is just like stay true to like your honor, or prioritize honor over personal desire in all cases. When like really in that example there was a lot of other extenuating circumstances, like for example there being like a system in place that like made it so that the woman so that love was like a status thing and not like a love thing, you know what I mean? And so he doesn't like really learn that, and it ends up biting him in the ass because he's unable to like assess the character of Kenneth Elmalloy, which ultimately leads to one of the top 5 betrayals of anime of all time.
Okay, so basically what happens is Lancer is now fighting with Kenneth's fiance while Kenneth is out. Unfortunately, Kenneth's fiance is not particularly adept at assessing the situation that she's put herself in, and so
Oh no.
she gets captured and disconnected from Lancer by Mayu and Emiya. They are basically like, oh, look at this fool just out in the open, and just basically just take her hostage. In the process, while that is happening, Kenneth goes to the church, aka Kyrie's father, and so there are these things called command spells, which all the masters have. And at first, it signifies you as a master of the servant, and you have 3 uses to compel your servant to do whatever you want, no matter what. They disappear over time as you use them. One of the main plot points is that the church has a store of extra command spells, and that they at one point are like, oh, as a reward for fight this one problem later, we'll give you an extra command spell. So Kenneth goes to the church and basically declares like, hey, I'm pretty much out. I need some protection. And can I get like another command spell or something? And Kyrie's dad is like about to give it to him. And when he gives him the extra command spells, Kenneth then just shoots him. Just kills him.
Yes, and then Kirei then comes back and takes all the command spells from his dad.
Right. And then Kirie comes back, sees this, and takes all the command spells of that, which probably is the signaling the point that Kirie has no more influences in his life other than Gilgamesh.
But that sort of gets to the dishonorable, as you know, Base was saying, the dishonorable nature of Kenneth Elmalloy.
Right. So then Kenneth comes back to his place with the command spell and Lancer, and they're fighting Saber. But in the process, Emiya basically comes up behind him and says, hey, I have your fiance. I will literally just shoot her in the face if you do not command your servant to kill himself. And let's just say, it is brutal.
Yup, brutal. He is straight up gangsta.
Basically, the deal is Emiya cannot harm Kenneth or his fiance if Kenneth commands Lancer to kill himself and retires. And so Kenneth, who maybe in his one genuinely good act does it, and to the detriment of Lancer, who this whole time has been fighting with this idea of honor and being like, I'm just trying to do the right thing, and and you know, he stabs himself, and in the end curses everyone there in a very tragic death. And you think, wow, this show is brutal. Emiya will literally do anything to get what he wants. And you think, well, that's the end. And then
Emiya, I think he lights a cigarette, right? Because
Yes,
he's a
he
total
lights a
badass.
cigarette.
Yeah, that was the
cigarette,
signal.
And he says, yes, I can't hurt you. And then Maya shoots Elmalloy and just straight kills him in cold blood.
yeah, shoots Elmioy and his fiance and just kills him and is like, yeah, I can't kill you. And that doesn't mean she can't. And then that was the point of the show where I was like, this show is brutal. Oh, I love it. It also marks a turning point for Saber, because Saber also kind of loses it and is just like, I don't understand you people. How could you let... Because at the time, Saber and Lancer had sort of a friendly rivalry where they acknowledged each other's strengths, but they were on the same plane of, oh, we're fighting for honor. Like, I enjoy fighting you. Whoever wins is going to be a glorious battle, And in the end, all that's left is betrayal, murder, like cold-blooded backstabbery, and Saber's just not about it at all.
Hey everybody, Base here. Wondering why the recording just stopped? Well, this because this is actually part 1 of our 2-part analysis of Fate Zero. So make sure you look out for part 2 being released on a stream platform near you. Remember to follow us on Twitter at @BoysAnime, that is at BoyZanime. Alright, I'll be sure to catch you all in the next episode. Peace!